Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Today on the podcast, we've carved out time for another fantastic, insightful, tragic, but meaningful debrief to share with you. Today, we're going to be delving into the Smithfield Market fire in London on the 23rd of January 1958. This incident, which was instrumental in modernising firefighters' breathing apparatus and breathing apparatus procedures, proved how great things can be achieved if society learns from tragedies. Two firefighters, Station Officer Jack Fort Wells and firefighter Richard Stocking from Clerkenwell Fire Station, died while fighting the blaze at Union Cold Storage Company at Smithfield Market in Covent Garden. Both firefighters were wearing proto-oxygen breathing apparatus. According to newspaper reports at the time, the pair were among the first to enter the dense smoke, never to be seen alive again. As always on the podcast, it's important to us to acknowledge the origin of this content, and we'll be sharing things today from the Museum of London, the London Fire Brigade website .gov.uk, from the FBU.org, and the majority of our content today comes from Beyond the Flames and More, a blog from a retired London fireman, written by David C. Pike. We're going to detail elements of the fire, the turnout, the construction, and then cover some background stuff around BA procedures and the changes that took place after this incident. Over 60 years ago now, in the early hours of the 23rd of January 1958, London saw one of its worst fires since the Blitz. The scene for this was the basement of the Smithfield Poultry Market in the heart of the city of London. Two firefighters, Station Officer Jack Fort Wells, aged 46 at the time, and firefighter Richard Stocking, just 31, lost their lives fighting this fire, and around 50 other firefighters from stations across London were injured or treated for smoke inhalation. All members of the public were safely evacuated. This incident lasted for over 3 days, as the fire burned and raced through 2.5 acres of basements underneath Smithfield Market, the flames leaping up through the poultry hall. On their arrival, the fire was discovered to be deep within the basement's labyrinth. The crews from Clerkenwell Fire Station were among the first on site. As you'll hear in today's debrief, Station Officer Jack Fort Wells and fireman Richard Daniel Stocking would head down into the dense smoke wearing breathing apparatus, with smoke completely filling the extensive basement, and tragically, they would never return to the surface alive. Eventually, after 25 hours at around 3 a.m. on the Friday morning, flames engulfed the ground floor of the market. The intense heat and flammable gases erupted from the basement, and fire quickly consumed the entire poultry market. As the flames reached over 100 feet high, it was decided that the fire was too fierce to extinguish, and the brigade began focusing their efforts on protecting the surrounding buildings. The stop message would eventually come at 16:45 on Friday the 24th of January, with over 700 oxygen cylinders being used by some 400 firemen wearing proto-breathing apparatus during the 3 days of firefighting operations. A total attendance of more than 1,700 officers and firemen, with 389 pumps and other appliances, attended from 56 of the 58 fire stations. The final brigade appliance withdrew from the scene on the 7th of February. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents, and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. Before we go deeper into the incident, let's talk about Smithfield Poultry Market. It was designed by Sir Horace Jones. The London Central Smithfield Markets, of which the poultry market was part, consisted of 4 buildings of almost equal size. They covered an area of around 10 acres, each one some 250 feet by 240 feet. Of particular note were the basements of these 2 buildings, which were slightly larger due to them running under the adjacent pavements. The building where the fire originally started was known as the Poultry Market. At the time of the fire, it was estimated that around 800 tons of poultry, game and meat was stored at the market. The single-storey buildings were constructed of load-bearing brick walls, with ornamental towers around 70 feet high at the corners of the centres of the buildings. It had a pitched slate boarding roof. The roof was supported on cast iron columns and beams, and none of these beams were protected against fire. The basement was constructed with a concrete floor. The ground floor, which is about 2 foot thick, was formed from brick arches and covered with 8-inch thick stone slabs. Inside the building, the galleries and ground floor were partitioned to form offices and shops. The partitions were built from timber, lath, and plaster on timber stud work. Breeze blocks rendered the plaster. The basement had been divided into 90 storage compartments. Many had been divided further into subcompartments. While some compartments were accessible via doors from the basement corridors, others could only be accessed by entering through trap doors in the ground floor of the market. Access into the basement was further reduced by a railway tunnel which ran diagonally through it. This tunnel was bridged at 2 points, using stepped crossovers, but these crossovers had limited headroom. From reports and sketches, the part of the Smithfield basement probably searched by Station Officer Fortwells and Firefighter Stocking consisted of some 2.5 acres of galleries and cold storage compartments. As mentioned, about 800 tons of meat and poultry were in the store. The entrance to the basement was made by a brigade down a spiral staircase leading into the engine room. Station Officer Fortwells and his crew were instructed to search for a padlocked door, the key of which had been given to the officer in charge by the market employee. Considerable difficulty was experienced in finding this door, which incidentally was covered by a tarpaulin, and it would appear that some 45 minutes was occupied in the search. Fortwells was accompanied by 4 firemen when the door was found. It was then opened and wedged back. 3 members of the crew pointed out to Station Officer Fortwells that their sets were running very low, and they returned to the street level. Fortwells and Stocking were discovered quite some distance apart. It was presumed that Fortwells, instead of passing through the door, which he had himself unlocked, turned into the wrong entry and found himself blocked in the chamber. Stocking, however, had gone forward and then met a dead end in the tunnel. With the expiration of the oxygen and their loss of direction, they were then overcome. The hose reel had been brought into the engine room and cooling room, but its length had expired many yards before the door in question. No tapes, lines, or pip horns were in use. Some access to the basement was available by electric lifts within the building and trapdoors, which were set in the pavement outside. Further entry to the basement could be made via tunnels that were used to pass refrigerated air to cool the basement. These tunnels contained heavy insulated doors that formed airlocks to prevent the escape of cold air. And one large section of the basement was insulated by slab cork covered with cement, and elsewhere the basement was insulated by granulated cork, slab cork, or slag wool held in place with timber, stoodwork, or matchboarding. A large amount of bituminous sheeting was used in conjunction with the insulation. In other news, this episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the centre of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. That integrates straight in with the Luna system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show. Next, we're going to include one London fireman story. Fireman John Bishop had started his career in London Fire Brigade in February 1949 at the age of 20. He had previously served 6 years at sea in emergent service, having joined at just 14 years of age. This red-haired young fireman started his days at Clerkenwell, the divisional headquarters of the former LCC B Division, which covered the City of London and East End. It was one of 4 divisional stations which covered London Fire Brigade's 58 stations. It was here he learned his craft, alongside wartime firemen and those returning from active duty in World War II, serving with the armed forces. John, or Ginger as he was known, learnt his craft the hard way, especially after he ended up in hospital for several days after attending a refuse lorry fire in a council yard. By 1954 he was promoted to leading fireman and remained at Clerkenwell. It was on the 11th of May 1954 that Clerkenwell's pump escape and pump were called to a fire at Langley Street off Covent Garden. It was fate that saved John from possible death and certain serious injury that day. The crews had been called to a 5-storey warehouse approximately 45 feet by 100 feet, packed with crates and market materials. The building had recently been fumigated with paraffin-based chemical. Whilst 2 firemen stayed outside to operate the pump, 7 others, led by Station Officer Frederick Hawkins, went inside to deal with the small fire. Leading fireman Bishop was detailed to walk around the back of the warehouse as others entered to climb the stairs. Suddenly the fumes inside exploded. The resultant shockwaves brought the roof down. The shingled roof covering was still reinforced with cobblestones, which had been placed on top during the war as protection against incendiary bombs, and the whole lot came crashing down, burying all of those on the stairs. The dead and injured were entombed in tons of debris. Whilst assistance was summoned, John and his 2 colleagues fought desperately to reach their fallen colleagues. Station Officer Frederick Hawkins and fireman AEJ Bat Rawdon died at the scene. 5 other firemen were seriously injured. Sub-Officer Sidney Peen, leading fireman Ernest Datlin, and firemen Kenneth Aylward, Frederick Parr, Richard Daniel Stocking, and Charles Gadd were all removed to hospital, where Charles Dadd later died of his injuries. 3 of the injured required plastic surgery treatment. Leading fireman John Bishop escaped with just bruises. Later on, by January 1958, John Bishop had been promoted to sub-officer rank, and on the 23rd of January he was acting station officer in charge of Red Watch at Whitefriars Fire Station, and whose ground adjoined the Smithfield Meat Market complex. The first call to the brigade was received at 2:18. It was a fire at Union Cold Storage premises in Smithfield Street. The Lambeth control room, located at the basement of the Fire Brigade headquarters, mobilised Clerkenwell's pump escape, pump, an emergency tender, together with Whitefriars pump plus Cannon Street's turntable ladder. It was evident on arrival that there was a fire within the basement. The problem was finding it. Bishop's crew were the first to arrive at the Smithfield Meat Market. He, together with another fireman, were preparing to investigate the thick smoke coming up from the market's basement when Station Officer Jack Fortwells from Clerkenwell arrived. As it was Fortwell's ground, and he was the substantive station officer, he immediately took charge. His first objective was to find the extent and seat of the fire. He was aided in his task by not only firemen using breathing apparatus carried on the 2 pumps, but the special breathing apparatus crew riding his station's emergency tender. Fortwells not only had difficulty in assessing the extent of the fire, but how to gain an effective access to it. 8 minutes after his arrival, and with no swift resolve in locating the fire, Fortwells sent the first assistance message, making pumps fall. Station Officer Fortwells had been taken by an employee to the plant room tunnel. Here he encountered thick smoke. Returning to the surface, Fortwells, rigged in his breathing apparatus set, and joined by his emergency tender crew, returned below to investigate further. The BA team entered the tunnel and attempted to locate the source of the smoke. The plant room tunnel was searched, but no fire was found. Information was received that the fire could be in the main basement, where access to it is secured by a padlocked door. Eventually, the crew found the door and were provided with a key. By the time the crew were running low on oxygen, of the 5 crew members, 1 gauge read 10 atmospheres, another read 5, and the final gauge was reading 0 atmospheres. 3 of the firemen left the basement and reported to their station officer, saying, "Leave the door open, I'm just going to take a look." Within minutes of the exiting men leaving the basement, the alarm was raised as others had not surfaced. However, due to the complex nature of the basement, it was almost an hour before the bodies of Station Officer Fortwells and Firefighter Stocking were located and carried out. The team here at the podcast are extremely excited to announce our brand new partnership with Patrol Store UK. Patrol Store has been serving the UK's police, fire and emergency communities and first responder sector since 2008, providing leading brands such as Hikes, Magnum, 511, Nebo, Op Zulu, Highlander, AKU and many, many more of our favourites. They are now also supplying bespoke uniform, PPE and station workwear to fire services around the UK. So for all our listeners that are part of your USAR, your HEART team, your ISAR team, your armed response teams, your fire investigation, your NALO, your hazmat and all of the training departments that have got your own budgets, be sure to get the absolute best for your team at a realistic price by contacting Aaron and the team at Patrol Store and referencing the Firefighters podcast. Patrol Store will also be taking part in our listener competition giveaways, as well as providing unique discounts to podcast listeners. So for people that are always asking about Hikes boots as an example, that is one unique discount code that is coming to you very soon through Patrol Store. We've also got some incredible bags. I mean, the Op Zulu bags are a game changer. So you know the really Gucci and expensive tactical black bags that everyone's using in CrossFit workouts and taking to the gym and taking to stations? Well, they've basically got that, but it's made better and costs less, because they're not slapping some Gucci expensive brand name on it and it's giving you what you want on a first responder salary. Be sure to keep your eyes in the notes of the episodes for links to unique offers and discount codes. And if you're looking to buy well and buy once, be sure to get in the notes and head over to Patrol Store UK. Now back to the show. John Bishop was interviewed about the fire by Channel 4 television some years ago. In it, he related the early stages of the Smithfield fire. When pumps arrived, thick acrid smoke was pouring out of the market's maze of underground tunnels leading to the cold storage rooms. With the arrival of senior officers from the B Divisional headquarters at Clerkenwell, Fortwells, although in command, he and his crew members were in the basement. John Bishop recalls the moment. Clerkenwell station officer and the firemen had headed down into the dense smoke, never to be seen alive again. Station officer Fortwells and ET fireman Dick Stocking had entered the fire wearing their proto-oxygen breathing apparatus sets that their pre-war counterparts had worn in the 1920s, over 34 years ago. In those early stages, with 6 BA carrying pumps and 2 emergency tenders in attendance, increasing numbers of firemen wearing breathing apparatus. These were committed to find and attack the blaze. John Bishop and his pump crews would be one of scores of teams to enter the Smithfield labyrinth. Again, he relates his story. It was a maze down there, and we used clapping signals. I was going down the centre and I'd send men down passageways here and there. You would walk along just one step at a time, with the back of your hand in front of you in case you walked into something red hot, making sure you're not going to fall down a hole. All we could find was passageways, with meat packed either side from floor to ceiling. The smoke got thicker. You could eat it. It was black, oily smoke. It was very cold down there, and you were cold. Even though you were sweating, that was the fear. John Bishop would be reunited with his former Clerkenwell workmate Dick Stocking for the very last time as he led the Whitefriars crew in search of 2 missing men. There was intense activity as the frantic search got underway, but it is highly likely that other lives were saved by the coolness of Assisting Divisional Officer Lloyd, the first senior officer to arrive, who checked the oxygen cylinder contents of each rescuer as they entered into the basement. Even so, many still put their own lives at risk by having less than half a cylinder full as they descended below ground. It was a crew from Manchester Square who located Fort Wells. He was found under packages and carcasses of meat not far from their entry point. His mouthpiece was laying on the ground, and he was lifeless. They started to return his body to the surface, but were relieved by the grueling, unenviable task by the BA firemen. Bishop and his team found Stocking against a blank wall in a dead-end passageway. He showed no signs of life. On his return to the exit, Bishop had to hand the task of recovery over to other firemen as his own oxygen supply was by now expired, but he still made it back out. For the next 24 hours, crews struggled to come to terms with the blaze. The cold January air turned into excessive heat as crews after crew combated the dense smoke and worsening conditions. Such were the arduous, physically punishing conditions that BA crews could not work for more than 10 to 15 minutes at a time. Despite the determination of the firemen, the complexity of the basement, the manner of its flammable insulation and stored meat products, the intensity of the fire was able to spread through much of the 2.5-acre maze underground the passages, this aided by air ducts and concealed ceiling voids. The dominance of the fire below ground forced superheated gases and smoke up into the street, heat through which the firemen had to struggle against when bringing jets to bear through some of the pavement openings and external trapdoors. Smithfield was ablaze, which had robbed London Fire Brigade of 2 of its own. It was a Clerkenwell fireman who knew Fort Wells that described him as one of the old smoke heaters who would never give up hunting for the sea of fire. Smithfield worker George Goodwin was an apprentice butcher working at Smithfield. He worked at a small family butcher's at 59 Long Lane. It was situated at the top end of the market, and as he arrived for work in the early hours of that Thursday morning, already there was a lot of police activity and plenty of fire engines at the poultry hall. Smoke was rising from the vents in the walkway outside the market. Long Lane was closed off, and the meat-carrying lorries were cleared from their positions, backed onto the entrances to the market to a place of safety. As he watched, the situation changed. More and more fire engines arrived. The smoke got thicker and blacker and hung over the market like a cloud. Not recalling exactly when, but rumours started to surface that there were a number of firemen hurt, possibly some killed. The meat workers were kept away from the activities taking place, but he wrote how he was relieved I was not a fireman. Crowds of market men in their long blue or white bloodied smocks stood watching as the firemen battled with the fire after the tragedy unfolded. Ever heard the quote that true leaders are readers? Well, we believe this is true. Listeners often ask where we go to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sector globally. So there are a few key publications which I encourage you to go check out. Now, if you're looking for insights on disaster management, fire protection and firefighting, for us, we go to Asia Pacific Fire Magazine. And when you're looking for the latest on the Middle East fire protection industry and fire services, it's Gulf Fire Magazine. And our quarterly check-in is with International Firefighter Magazine, reporting to municipal, industrial and fire training professionals. Now, next up, and widely accepted to be the global voice for passive and active fire protection. This is a good one. It's International Fire Protection Magazine. And finally, and perhaps the most relevant to our predominantly UK audience, I'd strongly suggest subscribing to UK Fire Magazine, reporting to the United Kingdom fire protection industry and fire services. We're really excited to announce that after a long-standing relationship and mutual respect, we've now partnered with MDM Publishing, who bring you all of these essential publications. Because in a world of change, the learners shall inherit the earth, while the learned shall find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. Eric Hoffer said that, and I believe he was right. So keep growing, keep learning, and keep yourself in the know and at the cutting edge of what's happening globally by dropping into the notes. And as a gift from the podcast, you can actually subscribe to any of these publications for free using the link in our notes. Now back to the show. Now let's cover the time frame of messages for the Smithfield fire. The original call came in at 2:18, and this was a call from Union, Cold Store, Smithfield Street, and Clerkenwell, Whitefriars and Cannon Street were mobilised. At 2:30, first message came in from Station Officer Fort Wells, making pumps 4, calling more pumps from Whitefriars, Red Cross Street, Euston and Clerkenwell. At 2:46 from D.O. Shawyer, a message came with a considerable amount of smoke issuing from the basement store market section. No fire yet. BA men searching. At 2:53, again from D.O. Shawyer, second ET required to stand by. This came from Lambeth. 2:55 from D.O. Shawyer, a building of 2 floors and basement about 300 by 300 feet. Part of the basement alight. A second external call came at 3:07 into Lambeth Control, reporting a fire at Charthouse Street, and D.O. Shawyer was informed. At 3:15 from D.O. Shawyer, it was reported they were making entrance at Charleston House Street. At 3:18, they were making entry from 2 different sides of the fire, Smithfield Street and Charterhouse Street. The fire has not yet been located, and 4 additional pumps with BA required to stand by. These came from Euston, Bishopsgate, Shoreditch and Southwark. At 3:25, a fire was finally located at the Charterhouse Street side of the incident. And at 3:42, now from ACO Cunningham, the message called making for pumps 8, with more pumps coming from Manchester Square, Old Kent Road, Red Cross Street, Cannon Street, Lambeth and Manchester Square. At 3:47, a call for emergency lighting came from ACO Cunningham. The extent of the fire still not known, and access being made from all available points. Deputy Chief Leet was also now mobile to the incident. At 4:08, the message came from ACO Cunningham making pumps 12, causing mobilisation from Holloway, Kensington, Burton Road, Brixton to come and support operations at the incident. At 4:33, a welfare message came from the Chief Fire Officer, ordering CAV at once with refreshments from 100 men. And at 4:48, a message from the Chief Officer requesting a second ambulance required at Smithfield Market. At 4:59, a message from the Chief Officer called for 10 pumps required as reliefs at 0600. At 0500, again from the Chief Fire Officer, was a call to make ambulances 4. At 5:07, the message came through from Chief Officer that Fireman Stropp had been removed to hospital. 7 minutes later at 5:14, again from Chief Officer reporting that Station Officer Fort Wells and Fireman Stocking, overcome by smoke, had been removed and taken to hospital by ambulance. They were pronounced dead on arrival. The stop message finally came in at Friday 24th at 16:45. The Fire Brigade of the late 1950s comprised of only 3 principal officers. The Chief Fire Officer and his 2 assistant chiefs, one nominated as deputy. All 3 remained in constant attendance in excess of 24 hours before either the deputy, Mr. Leet, or the ACO, Mr. Cunningham, was ordered to take charge of another major fire in Bermondsey. Delve was no stranger to major fires. However, the Smithfield fire would prove to be a watershed for the brigade's breathing apparatus procedures that had ramifications for the whole UK fire service. For Delve and his men, Smithfield would be one of the most difficult breathing apparatus incidents faced in their recent peacetime history. Sadly, Delve was no stranger to men dying on his watch. 9 firemen and officers had died in the line of duty since the end of World War II. When the Chief Officer first arrived at Smithfield Market, he was greeted by his crews facing thickening smoke and arduous conditions. BA crews were working underground in relays, seeking out the fire and attacking it wherever possible. The 2 emergency BA crews, who were situated at both entry points, ready to be committed to seek out colleagues in difficulty or find those who were overdue. Additionally, a further emergency crew stood by at Brigade's control unit, ready to replace the other emergency teams should they be required to enter the basement. The crews at Smithfield were relieved at about 4-hour intervals, plus the change of watch at 0900 and 1800 hours on the 23rd. Delve had discovered that his officers' attempts to get a feel for the layout of the basement were seriously hampered due to the lack of employee knowledge about its layout and locked doors. Delve consolidated the work of Divisional Officer Sawyer and Cunningham. Yet despite all their attempts to direct the extinguishment of the flames and the tenacity of Delve's firemen undertaking the task, a task which had them working in the most challenging of conditions, the fire was gaining a firm hold. it was spreading throughout the basement. Such were the conditions during the morning of the 23rd, crews had to be withdrawn from the Charterhouse Street entrance. All efforts were now concentrated on the West Smithfield Tunnel entrance. With day shift, Blue Watch crews, now fully engaged, attempts were made to create fire breaks in the flammable installation by teams of firemen. Large areas were painstakingly cut away from the basement walls and the ceilings. This was all to no avail, as the fire continued on its path of destruction. Flooding the basement was attempted and water was applied from every possible vantage point. The chief later reported that 500,000 gallons an hour was being pumped into the basement. Individual pump capacity in 1958 was in the range of 500 to 750 gallons per minute. However, the drains disposed of the water before it could make a significant impact on the fire. And later the flooding was abandoned as large quantities of water was penetrating nearby underground railway tunnels. Still with no noticeable effect from the previous firefighting efforts, by the late afternoon of the 23rd, Delve chose to push the fire back from the Charterhouse Street side towards the lift shaft in West Smithfield, from where it was hoped the fire would vent itself. The attack was made by fresh crews who inched their way into the basement. By this point the heat was so great that crews could not work for more than 10 to 15 minutes. Even then, many were overcome by the heat. They were assisted or carried towards the entry point by colleagues who were themselves affected by heat, and semi-collapsed firemen had to be hauled up the lift shaft by line before being removed to the St Bart's Hospital by ambulance. Yet, despite the attrition rate of his firemen, Delve pushed on with his tactics to advance and attack on a fire. However, as the heat and conditions below ground grew even more severe, the attackers were slowly forced back. Finally, Delve withdrew his men before they were overwhelmed entirely. As night fell, and the Red Watch firemen returned to the scene, it was hoped that the thickness of the ground floor, at almost 3 feet, could contain the fire, but it proved not to be the case. Late on Thursday evening, the first breach in the ground floor became evident. Jets positioned to contain the fire spread proved ineffectual. In the early hours of Friday morning, parts of the ground floor collapsed, allowing for massive escape of superheated gases and flame to spread upwards. Crews working inside the market building were withdrawn. The intensity of the fire was such that the cast iron columns lost their structural integrity, raising fears of the collapse of the roof, which later transpired. Delve, in anticipation of such developments, had previously ordered radial branches to the scene. It remains highly probable that at this point in excess of 20 pumps were actively engaged in containing the fire to the poultry market, despite pumps not being increased beyond 12. As the fire let forth its full ferocity, it rapidly consumed all before it. It was fueled by the insulated matchboarding wood, wool, bituminous tar, which had become deeply contaminated and impregnated with animal fats through the years of lack of service and maintenance. The physics of the now rapidly spreading fire was aided by the fact that the ground floor had a smaller footprint than that of the basement below it. Therefore, it acted as a chimney, allowing the furnace-like temperatures to overwhelm the firemen's attempts to contain it. Again, Delve was forced to withdraw his crews and they had to surround the blaze. There was no saving the poultry market now, and in the darkness of that January morning, the ornate corner, distinctive towers collapsed in spectacular fashion, the falling balls of flame adding to the pyre below. At its height, the 13 jets and 12 radial branches, fed by 10 pumps and supplied by 18 street hydrants, were throwing 16,000 gallons of water per minute into the blaze. It was left to the day watch to see the blaze subdued, not least because it had consumed all available fuel. It was late afternoon that the stop message was finally sent. Then the more mundane activity of damping down and eliminating hotspots started. The brigade would remain at the scene in ever-decreasing numbers until the 7th of February. It was during damping down that fireman Handy, from Bishopsgate, suffered serious injuries when he fell through the floor into the basement. The Lambeth control room during this time had not only handled the challenge in Smithfield Market in the period of the 23rd to the 25th of January, but also mobilised the brigade to a further 259 separate incidents. In addition, the brigade dealt with 7 4-pump fires, 1 6-pump fire, plus an 8-pump fire on the 24th in an office block in Southwark Street. This was followed by a 15-pump at a jam factory in Roll Road, Bermondsey, and a further 20-pump fire in the early hours of the 25th in a rubber dumped derelict warehouse, Poplar High Street, East London. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then chances are you are big into your own personal development and the development of firefighters around you. So I wanted to remind you of our mobile app Drill Book. This is a free training and development resources made by firefighters for firefighters. Heading on to Drill Book, you will find incident debriefs, radio messages, notes and lines, quick reference guides, quizzes every single day. We've got useful links to the ERG, to Web Rescue, to Jessup, Euro Rescue, 10-second triage, National Operational Guidance, and not to mention our daily quizzes where you will find questions on extrication, casualty handling, breathing apparatus, fire development, water rescue, rope rescue, you name it. It is the go-to resource if you've got a spare 5 minutes on the firehouse to develop yourself and those around you. Not only that, if you're looking to get into the fire service, we've got advice on there on interview questions, interview answers. You can build your own questioning in there. And again, remember, this is built by firefighters for firefighters, so you can add your own drills in there. You can pick the drills that you find the most favorite. There is literally hundreds of training ideas, hundreds of drills in there. Remember, this app is absolutely free and it grows every single day down to the contributions of our thousands and thousands of users. It's freely available on Android, Apple, and you will find it in the links for this podcast. Remember, it's called personal development. The clue's in the name. You've got to work twice as hard on yourself as you do on the job. So always be growing, always be developing. Now let's get back to the show. The aftermath. The City of London inquest was opened and adjourned on the 24th of January. The coroner, Mr. J. Milner Home, MA, approving the funerals of Jack Fort Wells and Richard Stocking. The funeral procession of the two Clerkenwell men took place on the 30th of January. Station Officer Jack Fort Wells and Fireman Richard Stocking were each carried on a wreath-laden turntable ladder, leaving Clerkenwell Fire Station with its honour guard. The fire engines, bearing the men's flagged, draped coffins, led the cortege through the Smithfield Market before moving on the South London crematorium at Streatham, passing the Fire Brigade headquarters with its honour guard en route. The men's funeral service was conducted by Reverend D. F. Strudwick, himself a serving London AFS fireman. The full inquest into the two men took place on the 28th of February and lasted 2.5 days. Mrs. Fort Wells' interests being represented by Andrew Fellel, QC, on behalf of the Fire Officer Association. Mrs. Stocking by Rose Hebron, QC, on behalf of the Fire Brigade Union, and Mr. Davis, QC, representing the London County Council. Rose Hebron, QC, was a legal pioneer in post-war Britain. She practiced mainly in personal injury and criminal law, and was the second woman to be appointed to a High Court judge. But in February 1958, at the request of the Fire Brigade Union solicitors, she looked after the interests of the Stocking family. Both Fort Wells and Stocking were found to have died from asphyxia due to the inhalation of fire fumes, known as carbon monoxide poisoning. This happened when trapped in the unventilated maze of underground chambers below Smithfield. Issues arose as to whether the men had proper supervision. Rose Hebron placed both Fire Brigade officers, including Delve, and the world-renowned pathologist, Dr. Keith Simpson, under detailed technical questioning, and she left no stone unturned. The jury returned verdicts of misadventure on the two deaths. The coroner recommended the adoption of an automatic warning device designed to be fitted to the breathing apparatus set, which would sound when the oxygen was running low. The coroner did not wish to look into the origin of the fire, and the cause of the blaze was never ascertained. In his recommendations, he also requested the installations of a dry sprinkler system installation in similar locations. Finally, he also required that a low cylinder warning device should be attached to BA sets, and further recommended that the LFB do this in a timescale of 2 to 3 weeks. Now a point on breathing apparatus procedures, given how the Smithfield Market incident had such an influential change on the entire UK fire service. Following Smithfield reports were submitted to the Fire Brigade Committee of the London County Council by Delve. Once again, lessons were to be learned. Some of the problems which occurred at Smithfield regarding BA procedures had occurred at two previous fires at Covent Garden, although a local LFB procedure was set up by 1956 following the second fatal fire at Covent Garden. This involved the provision of a BA control point. At Smithfield, this was in Charterhouse Lane to record the entry of men wearing BA into the incident. The control point consisted of no more than a blackboard and chalk. It recorded the name, station, location, time of entry, and time due date for every BA wearer. At Smithfield, this procedure proved invaluable. It indicated later in the incident that two men were missing and overdue. However, following the tragic loss of life at Smithfield, there were concerted calls for a more comprehensive schedule of BA procedures to be formulated. These calls came from Delve, Leet, his deputy, and Mr. John Horner, General Secretary of the Fire Brigade Union. Later that same year, Fire Service Circular FSC 37/1958 was issued. He detailed the findings of the committee of the inquiry and recommended the following: tallies for BA sets, a Stage 1 and Stage 2 control procedure for recording and supervising BA wearers, the duties of a control operator, the procedure to be followed by crews, and a main control procedure. In the accompanying letter to the circular brigades were requested to report their observations and recommendations in light of experience by the end of November 1959. There was at the time no specifications for the design and use of guide or personal lines. It was considered that more experience had to be gained. Recommendations were, however, made in respect of a specification for a low cylinder pressure warning device as a distress signal unit. Finally, and in light of the views of the fire brigades following Smithfield and based on their own experiences, it was clear that the use of BA would require more men to be better trained in its use and the safety procedures. Subsequent guidance on the selection of BA wearers was provided in FSC 32/1960. After agreement at the Central Fire Brigade's Advisory Council on the 27th of July 1960, it recommended 18 months operational service before BA training, a possible age limit for wearers, standards of fitness, and 2 BA wearers per appliance equipped with BA. This brings us to the end of the debrief at Smithfield Market Fire, London, on the 23rd of January 1958. Once again, we give credit and reference to the material used for this debrief. That credit goes to the fbu.org.uk, the Museum of London.org.uk, London Fire Journal, and finally the vast majority of this comes from Beyond the Flames and More. Narratives from a retired London fireman, written by David C. Pike. A special word of thanks also goes to Dave Goldsmith for sharing some of his extensive archive material in the completion of this narrative. It's always with great pride and difficulty that we share these debriefs on the podcast, but we do so in the hope that these lessons do not need to be learned again, and that we can all understand the origin of the practices, procedures, and operational tactics which we use every day out there on the incident ground. Once again, I want to honour the bravery and sacrifice of Jack Fort Wells and Richard Stocking of Clerkenwell Fire Station, who gave their lives in the line of duty at the Smithfield Market Fire, London, 23rd of January, 1958. There were no doubt errors made at Smithfield, but they have to be set in the context of accepted practices for that time. As tragic as the deaths were, the sacrifices were not in vain. Lessons were learnt and continue to keep firefighters safe every day. They help develop better BA procedures, and it remains both unfortunate and regrettable that it took their lives to bring about such change. Thanks for joining us once again on the Firefighters podcast. We'll see you next time. The Firefighters podcast was created to recognise, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.